Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another week of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how are you doing?
I'm well, and I'm thoroughly moved by everyone's concern about my, cardio activity. I must say it's very dangerous. I discourage anyone from trying to do any such thing. It's nonsense.
No, I agree completely. And of course, we are also joined by Ms. Sara Gon. Sara, how are you doing?
Oh, no, I'm doing well, Nick, and you?
I'm actually sick again for the second time in like 2 weeks. So I'm not too pleased about that, but I'm definitely on the recovering end. I am able to podcast today, which is much better than last time. But anyway, it was a fairly miserable weekend for me because of that. But that aside, let us start off with the kind of story that I always find endlessly amusing for no particular reason other than I can visualize it very strongly. And this is a minibus taxi in Northwest was stopped by some police officers from Freiburg who thought there was something suspicious about it. And indeed there was, as there were 21 suspected stolen sheep inside of it. And there's a picture, if you go and look at Times Live, you can find the story. And there is a picture of all the sheep crammed in between the seats of the taxi. It's rather amusing. The sheep were literally stolen at Sineng village, and their owner has been identified. And it reminds me of a story which I was told long ago of a police stop which found a car crammed full of a lot of people. And one of the police officers noticed that one of the children looked a bit odd in the middle seat. They were wearing an awful lot of clothes and they seemed a bit sort of ugly. And then it turned out that the child was in fact a stolen sheep who'd been propped up. Anyway, so stock theft aside, let's move on to our first story of today. And this is a comment by ANC's chief spokesperson, Pule Mabe, who said, when asked recently, that there's been this horrible spate over the weekend of shootings in taverns. In Soweto, 15 people were killed, and in Katlehong, 2 others were murdered. There was also a shooting in Pietermaritzburg in KZN. So really bad week for violent crime in the country. And Pule Mabe was asked to comment on this shortly after they happened. And he said, look, the safety of patrons in these establishments is the responsibility of tavern owners and not the country security cluster. He said it would be unreasonable to expect the country security cluster to dedicate a team to police taverns. The National Security Cluster is not responsible for these establishments to sell alcohol. The expectation is that those who run these establishments have got to go an extra mile to protect their patrons, he said on the sidelines of the ANC's Gauteng conference, which was happening at the time. Then he went on to talk about how it was too easy to get licenses for a tavern. We've got to discuss the minimum threshold for you to get a license to operate a tavern. We also need to discuss what security measures you're putting in place to protect patrons. If you don't, people will continue to lose their lives. So, Hermann, Sara, let me start with you. I feel like this is not a great answer to a question about a very serious crime problem. And I think I've read somewhere that a very large percentage of all the assaults and murders in the country actually do happen in fights between bar patrons. So I kind of think maybe this should be a responsibility of the police and a priority.
Yes and no. He's not entirely wrong. He just put it entirely badly. Of course, we don't have the police numbers to properly go around to taverns and see that they're complying with whatever paperwork needs to be complied with, and that there aren't underage drinkers in the tavern, and that's being properly policed. The problem, I mean, we're talking about a problem that's as old as the earth. You've got, because taverns are very easily set up, legal and particularly illegal taverns. They're in all sorts of places. I mean, the sheer weight of numbers would make it to that sort of policing intolerable. However, what is possible, I think, is that where you have say a big incident like this, where 21, 24 people are murdered, you're probably looking at some form of gang attack. It's revenge, or it's sending a message. AK-47s are being used. This is not someone holding up the cash register. And
right. Just to clarify on that point, according to police, a group of men armed with rifles, one of them being an AK-47, and pistols entered the bar and shot up the place.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah,
not.
that sounds pure mafiosi. I mean, you know, they're going in there to send a message, as I say, to wreak some revenge on maybe somebody who isn't even has anything to do with the patrons as such. Maybe the bar owner or something of that ilk. What the police do need to do, and this my impression is, I can't say I know for sure, but my impression is what the police are lacking above all is intelligence, good intelligence. And these sorts of shootings have to be handled through the gathering of good intelligence to be prevented. The police generally can't prevent crime per se in the physical sense. They're there to respond to it. The extent to which they prevent crime is that they are seen more to arrest, pardon the pun, the happening of crime, the crimes that they arrest people for do get solved. People do go to jail as a result. But other than that, it's very difficult because essentially they're almost playing the role of a social workers rather than anything else. But you know, Mabe is, you know, as spokesman goes, is a bit sort of foot in mouth. And I mean, the last thing we ever heard about police intelligence was Richard and Bluely, and look how well that went. So I think it's that sort of thing is you've got to do. And I mean, I suppose what one really could expect the police to do is to do it a bit like they do with cars on the highway, the spot checks.
No, exactly.
And deal with it,
exactly right.
you know, deal with it properly if you find something wrong. But something as big as this requires something much more much more discreet, shall we say, to be effective.
Exactly. What also strikes me in his comments here is he sort of goes on about saying, oh, it's too easy to get licenses for taverns or that kind of thing. But this is, to me, once again, a comment that shows that he's sort of completely detached from the reality of what the problem is. Arguably, it's kind of too difficult to get a license for these things. The problem is there's just a lot of illegal taverns, right? The processes aren't followed by a large number of people and the law is not properly enforced. And this is once again a recurring problem we see with ANC governance, which is like, we just need to make stricter rules, even when the current rules are not being enforced. Hermann, what do you make of this issue?
Yeah, my question to Pule Mabe would, in response to his answer, would be, all right, could you give us a list of what the security cluster is responsible for? Because they weren't responsible for the riots. They're not responsible for the 57 rapes that happen every day. They're not responsible for the murders that happen every day. They're not responsible for the cash and transit heists. It really is a a question of, okay, we might give ground here. We might give ground here and say that the state can't have a role in policing drunken violence. But that answer I would sort of accept from a government that manages to get the rest of the thing right. And what is a real annoying thing about the ANC is that they, with their, wonderful lovers of the National Party over many, many years, it's always apt, I think, that the National Party died in the loving arms of the ANC in 2005. The challenge that they face is that for decades, they undermine the social fabric of communities. They disincentivize responsible living. They disincentivize productive economic activity. They incentivize through, I think, a relatively unstructured social grant system, inactivity, laziness, nihilism, sort of on a deep psychological level. They spend decades trying to remove from individual citizens any ambition, any hope, any pursuit of satisfaction, any pursuit of happiness, essentially. And then when that plays out into the real life moral depravity that we see in our country, they say it's not their responsibility to police drinking. It's like we are having two different conversations. You can't disincentivize actual community cohesiveness, moral fiber, dignity through employment. And then when the chickens start coming home to roost, you just wash your hands of it. Fair enough. It might not be their responsibility to police drunken violence, but they've more than played their part by the time that that these sorts of events occur. And I would agree with you guys, actually. There is some relatively off-the-wall policies available for making these things more difficult. Is have patrols, have just more safe and well-policed areas of business activity. But no, I mean, let's not be ridiculous and think that the ANC could do anything along those lines. And I do think over the last 2 weeks, we've seen the disgusting puritanical streak of the ANC really coming through. I don't drink massively myself. But I must say I do get annoyed by Puritanism when it comes to this sort of alcohol be the cause of social ills. If anyone saying that did not pay attention to what happened in Prohibition era America, and anyone also saying that are fundamentally disconnected from reality. Of course, alcohol abuse is awful, but it is the top layer of sediment to a problem it's a top layer of sediment on the grave of a responsible and healthy society. And if the ANC thinks liquor licenses is sort of the solution to this, I mean, it just shows that they don't have a clue.
So, Sara, just some final comments from you, and also Hermann, your camera seems to be flickering a little bit there. I'm not sure why that is. But,
apologies, I'll try to fix it.
No worries.
No, I mean, the government always makes the mistake of deal with the problem by regulating further instead of regulating less, but putting certain conditions that making location a much stricter condition. I mean, a few months ago they were talking about allowing taverns, I think, in school premises, let alone next to school premises. I mean, that sort of thing is, it's just bizarre. It doesn't. I don't know where anyone would get something like that from. But it partly, really, that point goes to the idea of patrolling, goes to the spat between Beketele, ironically the police minister, and I suddenly forgot his first name, Cameron.
Ian Cameron.
Because what Cameron was essentially saying when this whole thing blew up was, your police need to patrol those streets. They need to be in there. They need to see what's happening. They need to assist women, walking alone, or children, or whatever it is. That's the sort of. It's not all the answer. Obviously, far too complicated. I mean, this may well have been a hit because tavern owners wouldn't pay protection money, so it really would be a mafiosi thing. But it's that really ABC of policing that one's talking about, not the exotic stuff, except for the intelligence, which, as one of our audience said, that in the same word as the police is a bit rich. But you really, it's almost like at the bottom end of policing and at the top end of policing is what you probably need in those areas. Not the stuff in between happens because the police have to do it when something goes wrong. But it's not. It's those two basics, and the ANC destroyed police intelligence gathering. I mean, all good police services everywhere in the world rely on informants, which is about gathering intelligence, and two is the quality of the intelligence gatherers.
Right, and indeed, if the many of the activists involved in this area are to be believed, and I think they are. The police have also actually the problem has gone the other way, in that rather than the police having informers in the gangs have lots of informers in the police, which of course makes it a much bigger problem. Okay, let's move on to our next story. Hermann, I know you've been salivating to talk about this because this is your sort of personal passion. This is what you're really keen on, and that is we've had some exciting developments in British politics over the last couple of days. So on Thursday, I think just before we started recording our show, Boris Johnson announced that he was going to be resigning once a new leader of the Conservative Party of the UK is elected. He's going to be stepping down as Prime Minister, I think probably in October. That date may have changed. Hermann, I'm sure, will be able to update us. And that has set off another vicious leadership battle within the British Conservative Party, the Tory party, for who is going to replace Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So Hermann, can you take us through kind of the end there of what happened to Boris? He went down. he looked like he was going to try sort of beat it all off, and then he eventually went down when the resignations got too many. And how's the leadership contest shaping up?
Yeah, so a brief, very, very brief history is Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister following Theresa May's resignation in 2019 on her failure to get a Brexit deal past Parliament. Boris tries with the parliamentary arithmetic as it was at the time to get the Brexit deal through, renegotiate it, but the Parliament was deadlocked. He calls an election. The House votes in favor of an election to under a now defunct law, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. And in 2019, Boris Johnson's Conservative Party achieved their greatest overall majority in the House of Commons since the 1987 election of Margaret Thatcher. Then in comes this new government heading into 2020. They get the Brexit deal done. They or most of it done to significant satisfaction that that various interest parties can feel this is now a step forward. And just when it seemed like Boris Johnson's government could hit its stride, COVID came. And Johnson initially was very libertarian in reaction to this. There were rumors of him getting injected with a COVID-19 virus on camera to show people it was just an aggressive flu. And that all seemed to change when Boris Johnson got COVID and almost died. He came back from that experience very much a nanny statist in many ways. Obesity was early on linked as a comorbidity of COVID, and boom, the Conservative government was now into the business of trying to regulate sugar intake and those things. You saw massive lockdowns, even at times when the lockdowns seemed to ease, they would come back with a vengeance. And this sort of led to a slow creeping distrust amongst the libertarians or the classic liberals and libertarians in the UK Conservative Party, which believed that when in doubt, give people the freedom to choose. So this started the erosion of what used to be Boris's base. The people who wanted to get Brexit done lined up very neatly with the classic liberals in the Conservative Party, or people like Steve Baker, even your people like Jacob Rees-Mogg. And slowly but surely, his authority and his trust relationship with these people broke down. Then came a year of scandal. There was a guy called Chris Patterson, he worked for the IR, Owen Patterson, who was a loyal lieutenant of Boris for many, many years, who then was found to have transgressed parliamentary standards and was forced to resign, and there was an effort to save him that was ill-fated. That was the first of a real series of scandals. Then it came out that there were Downing Street parties during lockdown, and that further undermined trust in Boris Johnson. Then came the tax rises, breaking the manifesto pledge of the Conservatives that they won't put up taxes. But you had this interesting dynamic where Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Minister of Finance, wanted to, said it was necessary to raise taxes because Boris Johnson wanted to spend, because at heart he revealed himself not to be a small government conservative along the lines of, perhaps someone like Thatcher or Michael Howard, but actually a Heathite, rather center-left spender and big government kind of guy, especially on things like net zero, where they wanted to, by 2050, get the UK economy to emit no carbon dioxide as a net consideration. This further undermined what used to be, until recently as David Cameron, a low-tax conservative base. That grew disenchanted with Boris Johnson as someone who has turned into a nanny statist, who now wants a high-spend, high-tax government. And what ultimately sort of preceded the lockdown, the overture to his fall down, was the fact that Boris, for all his ills, was considered to be a vote winner, the electoral asset to the Conservative Party. He had won the mayoralty of London twice, London being a heavily Labour city, and then he won this great majority for the Conservatives, something that people had thought a thing of the past. But then came two by-elections that the Tories got clobbered in. There was a seat in the south, traditional Tory heartlands, went to the Liberal Democrat Party, and a seat in the north, a new sort of red wall, quote unquote, seat for the Tories, emerging into the traditional heartlands of the Labour Party. And both of those on one night fell from spectacular majorities to these opposition parties. And then the nailing, the writing was on the wall. Boris could no longer claim he was a vote winner. And the really last thing that broke it was it came out that Boris Johnson had knowingly appointed as deputy chief whip to his government a guy called Chris Pincher, who had credible allegations of sexual harassment against his name. And Boris sent cabinet colleagues out into the media to do the rounds and say Boris had no idea that he had these credible allegations against him, only for 2 or 3 days later to transpire that Boris did know. So this is a man with a dodgy relationship to the truth and someone of immense complexities. He will go down in history as a short-lived prime minister. I think he would be in the bottom half of the 55 people who have held the office, but he was truly transformative. I think getting Brexit for what it's worth and for the extent it is done isn't something small. But Johnson lost his magic, he lost his party, and then over a period of a few days, there was this effort to rely on good old British rules of politics, and that is if the general appearance is that you've lost the trust of your party, you resign as the noble and honourable thing to do. Theresa May didn't do it, and Boris Johnson took not doing it to an art form. He lost in 2 days 59 members of his government. Maybe 7 of them was cabinet level posts, but most of them actually junior cabinet government levels. So then ultimately, he had to go. There was no way for him to stay. Now we're into a Tory leadership election, and it's rumored that the 1922 committee, the controlling parliamentary unit of the Tories in government or in Parliament, want that election to be done and dusted by the 5th of September. And there are significant runners and riders. I'll quickly run through them and then shut up. You've got the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak. You've got the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. You've got the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nadhim Zahawi. You've got the Chairperson of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament, Tom Tugendhat. You've got the former Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch. You've got the former Defence Minister and current Paymaster, Penny Mordaunt. You've got the former Health and Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. You've got the current Attorney General, Suella Braverman. Then you have, I am missing someone, Saeed Javid, former Home and Health Secretary. And it is very, very interesting that I see someone saying bunch of fickle poms. This is the most, in terms of socioeconomic, ethnic, class, the most diverse leadership election that any UK political party has ever faced. You've got people like Kemi Badenoch, who's from Nigeria, and then you've got people like Rishi Sunak, who is a multi-millionaire, originally with his parents from Pakistan and India. So this is an interesting time. It is a battle for what does the Tory party become now? Is it the Johnson party of big spend, big taxes, but with social conservatism? Or is it more a Thatcherite, classically liberal party of big growth, low taxes, and social liberalism in a way of allowing the individual to do what they see best? Well, it's all up for grabs, really. It's a massive field, about 10 credible candidates. My personal favorite is Kemi Badenoch, but I don't think going into my political crush on her will now necessarily promote, the discussion of the Daily Friend show.
We'll keep that in mind if we're running excess on time. I must say, I always had a bit of a soft spot for Boris. I found his personal sort of style of politics rather entertaining and comforting. It really appealed to me on a sort of personality level. And I have always been very glad that he defeated Jeremy Corbyn, who I thought was a very bad influence in the UK political system. And so I think for those reasons, I'm willing to cut him slack, despite many of the missteps that he made later. Sara, what do you make of all this?
There was a heading of an article online about it saying Boris killed Boris. And I think that's the problem, is I think he had that curious personality that was just so unlike anything that had come before, that managed to get Brexit through. I mean, he got Brexit through. I think the problem is that, and I think people were prepared to forgive him the lies, because from the word go, the people who knew him said that he's a lying piece of something.
Yeah, he was well known as a liar before he was prime minister.
Exactly. But I think the problem is that once the Conservatives started two things: the spending, the taxing, and coinciding with everything else going up, inflation rising to levels not seen for many, many years. That added to when the party was faced with the losses in the by-elections, I think that over the forgiveness, they stopped forgiving. And I think that's essentially what happened. I must support Hermann in the sense I like him in Badenoch as well. And Also, again, some of the online papers I've read, like her, they acknowledge that she's a bit inexperienced and she's young, but she's principled, she's classically liberal. And I think the problem is that conservatives were kind of messing around a bit with the on the philosophical side. They're ranging from the one side to the other side and sort of everything in between. And I think that's a legacy that Boris has unfortunately left them.
I quickly want to jump in there and just make a recommendation.
Sure, quick.
Go watch Kemi Badenoch's maiden speech on YouTube. It's just brilliant. 9 minutes of brilliance. And also go watch her defense on YouTube of the race and inequalities audit that she led as equalities minister. She comes out swinging against CRT, and she really shows she knows what she's talking about. She is inexperienced, but this morning, Michael Gove, probably one of the most dynamic and successful cabinet ministers of the last decade in the Tory government, endorsed her. So will she win? I doubt that she is green, but I really, really hope she does. And Michael Gove gave her a big boost this morning.
Sorry, can I just say refer to the fact that the comment about the multicultural mix of the Conservative Party is really credit to them, because it appears it's been done on merit, and Labour's kind of trailing way behind on that.
Right, it'll be very funny if Woke Labour is not in fact the party that elects the first non-white Prime Minister of the UK. I will be endlessly amused by that. But anyway, so we've got to cover one more story, and this is another big one. On Friday, there was the terrible news coming out of Japan that the longest-serving Prime Minister in Japanese history, Shinzo Abe, was assassinated while giving a campaign speech in the city of Nara in Japan. Abe was not. He was the leader of the country's biggest political party. It's sort of the party that's dominated Japanese politics since the end of the Second World War, which is the Liberal Democratic Party. He was giving a speech on behalf of them when a man walked up behind him and shot him with a homemade gun. He was shot in the neck and I believe in the heart as well. So he unfortunately did not survive, despite a lot of efforts to save him. His party faced the election over the weekend and managed to win a majority in one of the houses of the Japanese parliament, winning at least 63 seats, possibly more. And many Japanese leaders said that Japanese people needed to go out and vote, as this assassination was an attack on their democracy. Now, this is extremely unusual for Japan. Japan is a country with an extremely, extremely low murder rate and very few firearms. This guy appears to have just built his firearm out of the stuffy pipes and bits of machinery, and watched some video tutorials on YouTube. He's a 41-year-old guy called Tetsuya Yamagami, who apparently was possibly previously involved in the Japanese Navy for a short period of time, although a lot of details about him are still unconfirmed. So according to the early interviews with the police, while there was a lot of concern that this may have been some kind of political assassination, it's not clear whether that was the case. He apparently said that he had assassinated Abe because he believed Abe had promoted a particular religious group that his mother belonged to, and this group had bankrupted his mother. So he was taking personal revenge on Abe for his activity. There's no evidence, however, that Abe has actually been involved with this group at all. So it may be that this guy has just got a few screws loose. His apartment was filled with explosives, and apparently 3 days before he had tried to kill Abe with explosives, but had decided against it when he wasn't able to gain access to the venue that Abe was speaking at with his explosives. This is a big blow to Japan. I think Abe was a very successful leader. He had managed to help stabilize the Japanese economy after a very long period of economic sort of malaise. He also pursued a very aggressive foreign policy against China and tried to unite the US and East Asia together and India as well in an alliance to contain Chinese aggression, particularly against Taiwan. He was a big friend of Taiwan. But what's on the darker side, he was long accused of covering up for Japanese war crimes during the Second World War, particularly with regard to the forcible recruitment of so-called comfort women as forced sex slaves, basically, of the Japanese army in Korea. which I think has always stained his reputation. He was also descended from people accused of war crimes during the Second World War, and that I'm sure didn't help the perception. But Sara, very briefly, we're over time. Your thoughts on this?
Really, just one thought. It's in the midst of the tragedy, it's really wonderful to see a country where people are uniformly shocked by a crime like this. I mean, I think the same thing here would just be item 3 on the news.
No, that's a very good point. Hermann, very briefly, your thoughts?
Yeah, I must say, Abe isn't someone I know terribly a lot about. Just 2 weeks ago, I actually bought a biography of him to learn about him. So that sort of will haunt me now a bit. But I must say, if you look at who celebrated his death and who mourned it, it does indicate on which side of history he was. The leaders of the Liberal Party in Australia, Scott Morrison, Malcolm Turnbull, really people I would consider on the right side of politics broadly. Identified him as a strong regional player against the threat of the CCP. Was he perfect? By no means. But I must say the way in which he relinquished office and the way in which he adhered to Japanese sense of honor in public life is something that makes this even more tragic, just on a human level.
Oh, definitely. All right. So I wish we could talk more about that, but unfortunately we're out of time now. So thank you very much for listening. We hope that you enjoyed the show. Please subscribe to us. Please like the video. Please leave us good comments, good podcast reviews, all that good stuff. And we'll see you tomorrow on the Daily Friends Show. Cheers, everyone, and have a great day.